Today we're going to use the power pin effect in After Effects to superimpose some footage on the side of buildings. So what I usually do is I grab the piece of footage, scrub through it to find the frame that I like. Once I find that frame, then I apply the CC power pin effect to it. But usually people would automatically start grabbing the edges and start trying to pin the edges to the sides of the buildings. I think what we need to do is grab that piece of footage and align it to one of the edges so you have a reference point. So instead of just going all willy-nilly with the edges and the pinpoints, you have a reference to where you want that image to start distorting the edges and pin them to the edges of that building. Sometimes the thing about power pin, what happens is that you're gonna have to go way beyond the comp's borders in order to get a decent pin. You can use the little circular crosshairs to move the pin, or you can use the digits to move the pin up and down just to get precise control over it. And every now and then you have to zoom in to make sure that pin is pinning to each of those little corners on the building. So there you go. Getting that little edge of the building, trying to get it to that edge right there. Boom, I think I'll almost have it here. And once I get that little pin right there at the edge of the building, then I can start working on the other ones. And here I had to zoom all the way out in order to see what I'm doing. Because as you see, that little crosshair, that little control right there, it's not in the comp anymore. And then here I added a grid effect to the layer so that I can see what I'm doing. Because sometimes when you're corner pinning the footage, you don't really know if you're distorting it the right way. When you use the grid effect, you're able to line up the lines from the grid to the lines of the object or building you're trying to superimpose your footage on. And a big thing about the corner pin is you can use this effect, just make sure that you're not distorting your footage to the point where you're squishing it. You want to maintain the aspect ratio of your footage so that when you're comping in the footage over your building, you're not squeezing it down and doing a whole bunch of other distortion to it. So I try to maintain that 16:9 or that 9:16 aspect ratio. So here you go. I'm getting closer to aligning those lines to the side of the building. And once again, this is back and forth because the footage is 16:9 and that building is 9:16. So I'm trying to superimpose a 16:9 piece of footage on a 9:16 side of the building. One thing that makes this compositing hard is the camera angle. Or the camera lens, I think it's 14, 18, and 24 millimeter. So this thing is super wide. All right, so here what I'm doing is I'm making sure that I open up another comp viewer on the side so that I can start messing around with the image on the right side so that I can mask it out so that it fits on the building. Because remember, this piece of footage is 16:9. In order for this to work, we have to mask out the side of the footage. So here I'm fine-tuning this green mask that I created. And if you notice, the piece of footage on the right, it's a perfect 16:9 aspect ratio. So as soon as I added that matte, you start seeing little errors in the power pin effect. So I had to go back into the main comp and start fine-tuning those edges. And every now and then you go back and forth between the grid effect and your footage to make sure that the grid looks good on the side of the building and that the footage looks good. And now I'm shifting the image over to make sure that this man is in the middle of that first side of the building. So once again, working this way, you're able to corner pin a piece of footage, but then pre-comp that piece of footage, and you're able to manipulate that piece of footage in another comp. So it's always good to pre-compose your footage first and then apply whatever effect you're gonna apply to it so that you have two levels of control. You have the power pin level of control, and then you could go within the comp and do whatever you wanna do, and it's not gonna interfere with the power pin effect. What I wanna start doing is testing blending modes to see if I can retain some of the reflection of the clouds just to make it a little bit more realistic. So what I did here was I copied the background footage. I'm gonna overlay it and I'm gonna extract the lighter parts of the background layer and superimpose it over the footage. So I made it black and white by using the black and white effect. And now I'm gonna add levels to it. And I'm gonna crank down the blacks by going to the mid level to crank down the mids in order for us just to have the clouds show. So now I'm just going through blending modes, trying to find the best one. And screen is always good because what screen does is it retains the lighter parts of the footage and then knocks out the blacks. And then once I figure out the blend mode that works, I just crank down the opacity. So now if you look very closely, you get to see those clouds over the piece of footage. And what this does is allows you to get a little bit of extra realism in there. So I'll just scrub back and forth just to check out that texture. And if the texture works, then I'll just move on to the next part. So as you can see, the texture actually works. The texture is on top of the piece of footage. I lowered the opacity down to 20%. And as you can see, when we scrub through the piece of footage, we get the clouds over the piece of footage. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna copy the first panel and we're gonna drag it up to the top left edge of the building, line that up. The reason why I do this is so that I can have a reference point where I'm gonna start corner pinning from. So now we can click on that layer, click back on the corner pin and drag that little crosshair to that edge right there and line it up to the bottom right of the previous piece of footage and start messing around with these other target points. And once again, like I said, this was shot at a super wide angle. So this is going to get crazy very quickly. And the plan is to maintain the aspect ratio of the piece of footage so that we're not squashing it like this. But mostly when I'm doing composites like this, I'm trying to maintain that 16:9 aspect ratio. So if the dude's face is getting squashed too much, I know I'm going too far. There you go, lining it up to the top of that building. Using some of the buildings right there on the bottom right to guide the corner pin effect. So I zoom in, make sure that I get that edge right there. Boom, boom, boom. That looks good. And then go down to the bottom right, see if that edge looks good. All right. And then now we could pull this bar over to the left and make sure that we attempt to get that 16:9 aspect ratio back. And now what I'm doing is I'm copying this piece of footage, relabeling it, and then swapping it back out here so that now we have a panel 2 comp. And now whatever I do in panel 2, it's not going to mess up what I did in panel 1. So now what I'm doing is I'm moving this matte that I made to the left in order to start masking out that piece of footage. Just keep on moving the matte over to the left until we hit that right edge. And once we hit that right edge, if it looks good, we're good to go with the power pin effect. So that looks good to me. Now we have to shift the piece of footage over to the left so that it could line up with the first panel. So here we go. Now we're in the panel 2 comp and we're able to see what we're doing in the panel 2 comp on the right side of the screen. And we're also able to see it in the main comp. I usually work like this because it's just way easier to have your main comp on the left and the comp that you're currently working on the right. I noticed a little mess up right here on this right edge. So I'm just fixing up the corner pin now. And you're not going to be able to see that until you start messing around with the elements in your comp. So now we can just press 0 just to pre-render and see if this thing animates through and it looks decent. Now what I'm doing is I'm going in there and I'm starting to line these edges up because I noticed that the new panel that I created, it's a little bit higher than the current panel that I created. So I'm just trying to bring that bottom left edge down a little bit. So once again, if the digits don't work, then just use these little controllers on the sides to do it. There you go. So I'm lining up that little edge right there, going up to the top, making sure that the top is aligned. Just make sure that I scoot it over so it overlaps with the other panel. Come to this edge, move it up a little bit. What I usually do is I'll solo the background layer on and off just to see if everything's working. And now the next step to this is doing the same process we did with the clouds on the first panel and copying the background again so that we can overlay the building's texture on top of the second panel. So if we look closely, we get to see a little bit of the clouds at the bottom. And what we want to do is we want to crunch those blacks down in order just to get a little bit of the texture of the building and a little bit of those clouds in the building. And if you see, now we have some of those clouds overlapping on top of the piece of footage. And then I lower the opacity down to 20% just so it can be subtle over the footage. A viewer may not see this, but it still adds a level of realism. You can see the clouds at the bottom, but I wanted to add a little bit of extra building texture on top of the footage. So what I did was I copied the background, went in there, added a black and white effect, and then I added a levels effect, crunched down the blacks so that we retain some of that texture, brought up the whites a little bit so that we get some of that texture in there. And then we can go through the blending modes by pressing Shift plus or Shift minus. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down that texture to 20% just to see if I can see it on top of the building. Because we get the clouds at the bottom of the building. That looks cool, but I also want a little bit of texture. I'm just pick whipping these reflections and these textures and using the alpha matte of the panel 1 and 2 to mask out these textures so that these textures are not being overlaid on top of the original background footage. And there you go. I can see the texture. I can see the building texture over the footage. So we're getting this level of realism. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm lining up that S with the S from panel 1 because right now it looks wonky. Then I have to do a little bit of tweaking to that corner pin effect. So I'm going to have to mess around with those corners and make sure that I'm getting the right pin going on. There you go. Match those two edges up to each other. Make sure that there's no imaginary split line in between them where you can see just a little bit of alpha. Here, line that up. Just line that up. Boom, boom. Line that up. And remember, when you're messing around with the power pin effect, you have to go back and forth between your footage. Stretch that out to the side. Make sure that this bottom right corner is aligned to the edge of that building and move it over a little bit. And here we're just going to press 0 on the keyboard to make sure that we pre-render at least 5 to 10 seconds so that we can see if the comp works. All right, this is looking good to me. Now we can copy panel 2, duplicate it, and After Effects automatically creates panel 3 for us. And then we can drop a power pin on this and align it to the last part of that building. Move that piece of footage up to the top left so that we can have a reference point for the power pin. There you go. Once we get it aligned to that top left of the building, we can start power pinning from there. Go back to your power pin so that we get the controls and start moving these points around. There you go. Boom, boom. Let's add a grid effect so that we can see what's going on. Make sure that you apply the grid effect before the power pin effect so that we can see the grid. Zoom in and start moving those points around to align them to the edge of that building. We're going to drag that and make sure that now we go in there and we start tweaking. And this just gives us a better reference point as to if the footage is really living within the contours of the edge of the building. Go in here and start tweaking those edges. Start tweaking those edges. There you go. That's looking good to me. Then we can go back up here. Start working on that top right edge. Boom. That looks good to me. Work on this bottom right edge. And it started to get there. Then what we can do is just grab that edge right there and pull it back out so that we maintain the aspect ratio of the piece of footage so that text at the bottom is not being distorted too much. And then now let's go into panel 3 and start moving that piece of footage over to the right and left so that it could align to panel 2. There you go. Move that up a little bit, because the plan is not to mask out anything. Make sure that we have this power pin in an area that we don't have to mask out those flags at the bottom. We don't have to mask out any trees. So now what I did was I went back to panel 3 and started moving the mask over to the left so that it can mask out the right edge of the building. And now what we need to do is just test out the animation. You press 0, you start testing out this animation, seeing if it looks good. So what I'm doing here is I'm making a copy of the background again so that we can use the texture of the building as an overlay on top of panel 3. So we're doing the same process, darkening the darkest areas of the building and trying to maintain some of the lighter areas of the building so we can get some texture in there, give it a little bit of realism. Then what I did was I picked with panel 3 so that I can use panel 3 as a matte for the texture. And then I turned it back on. And what I'm doing here is I'm tweaking that opacity so that I can see the texture over the building. I don't want it to be overwhelming, so I'm trying to find the sweet spot. So there you go. I think that looks good so far. I'm gonna start color correcting this background footage because I think it's a little too blown out. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lower those mids, just lower them a little bit, and then lower the brightest part of the footage so that it doesn't look so blown out. And then just check out how the footage on top of the buildings is playing and seeing if everything looks right. There you go. Let's just scrub through it, check it out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all 3 panels and I'm going to pre-compose all of the overlays so that we don't have a billion layers in this comp. And now we could turn on this switch right here in order to see all the effects and all the overlays on top of the footage. And this maintains all of the blending modes from that overlay comp we just created. So all those blending modes will pass through onto this new comp. All right, so that looks good. Now I'm just going back here, tweaking this background a little bit, making sure that it's not blown out, lowering those highs a little bit, and replaying the footage to see if everything looks right. All right, I think the composite looks good right now. But what I want to do is I want to add a little bit of brightness to panel 1 to reflect how the sun is hitting the side of the building. So I'm just going to brighten it up a little bit just so that we can get 3-dimensionality, so that the panels on the front of the building are a little bit darker than the panel on the side of the building. So here you go, we get some 3-dimensionality now. And I think that looks good. And I'll just let the footage play. I usually trim 5 to 10 seconds of the footage just to see if this thing is working out. I'm going to make a ping of the background because we're going to replace the sign to the bottom right that says purple zone. We're going to replace it with the person's name. All right, so what we're doing with this background image is we're going to cut out this purple zone. And how we're going to do that is we're going to use Photoshop's generative fill magic in order to delete this purple zone out of here and maintain that purple background. So what I'm doing is I'm using the lasso tool to select the purple zone, adding a little bit of more selection there, and then using generative fill in order to remove it. Now these don't work, but the last one worked perfect. But there's this little line here. And what I'm going to do with this little line here is just make a new layer, use the rubber stamp tool and just rubber stamp that out. There you go. Rubber stamp that out. And boom. Now that little line is gone. Boom, boom. And now it's time to add some text to it. And luckily this font right here worked out perfect. Now we're going to scale the text up. We're going to use the edges to distort the text so that it fits in the sign, and just move them around until we get something that looks right. There you go. Make sure that we rotate it so that we get those edges there so they're parallel. There you go. Boom, boom. Move it out. There you go. I think that looks good. And if we scale back out, people wouldn't notice that you changed that. We don't have to get detailed. Now I'm using the color of the original purple zone text in order to colorize this Nelly Nell text. I'm bringing all those other layers back on so that I can see what it's doing. And now I'm just going to mask where these little bolts are, just to get an extra level of realism in there. Boom, boom. Very subtle touch. No one's going to notice this, but I feel that this is what we need to do. Just these little things. Now let's make a group, make sure that everything lines up. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a background of that purple area. I'm just going to make sure that when I bring this into After Effects, that it has a purple background around the text so that nothing shows behind it. So I'm just going to go over the contours of this sign right here. I could use the pen tool, but I found that the Magic Lasso, if you use it for quick things like this, it just works out. But now if you really wanted to get precise, I would use the pen tool and really tweak those rounded corners and make sure that we get perfect rounded corners. But for a job like this sign is so small and it's not in your face that we can go this route. There you go. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Ctrl J to copy that background from the main image, place it into the folder. There you go. If you're not really looking at it, you wouldn't notice that text was replaced or anything. And that's it. Now let's bring this into After Effects and see if it lines up. All right. So now we're back in After Effects. So what we're going to do is import that PSD and place it right back into the comp. Make sure you choose Composition Retain Layers in order for After Effects to bring in the PSD as layers. All right. We drag that into the comp and we look at the comp and make sure that the sign is lining up. And let's pre-render it just to see how it looks over the video. The good thing about this video is that it's a static shot. So when we import a PSD like this, we don't really have to do any tracking or anything to composite it into the scene. All right, that's looking good to me. Now, one thing I noticed is that the text is a little too sharp for my liking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a fast box blur to the text just to soften it a little bit so that it matches the video footage, and just bump it up slightly. Let's say 0.1 works for this text. There you go. That looks good. Let's go back out into the main scene and see how that's looking. I think that looks good. Let's zoom out to check it out. And there you go. I think this looks good. I think we're done. I hope you guys got value from this tutorial. I'm going to try to upload more soon. Peace.